The fun fair was one of those places that felt frozen in time. Everything was old, but not quite ancient, the kind of battered charm that made people nostalgic. Paint flaked from the rides, and the carnival booths smelled faintly of damp wood and spilled beer. I'd been coming here since I was a kid, back when my dad used to bring me to ride the dodgems and win cheap stuffed toys. Even now, as an adult, there was something comforting about it, even if it didn't quite feel the same anymore. The clown had been part of the fair for as long as anyone could remember. His name was painted in curling letters across a sign near the funhouse entrance. Chester the Cheerful. His costume was garish, bright yellow and red with oversized buttons and shoes. The makeup looked caked on, exaggerated features frozen into a smile that never seemed to reach his eyes. Kids loved him, or at least they had when I was younger. By the time I was a teenager, Chester was more of a joke than anything else. People whispered that he was creepy, that his laugh felt forced, that he always seemed a little too close, like he didn't know when to back off. Still, he was harmless enough, just another part of the fair's faded charm. That night, the fairground was packed. A warm evening meant families had come out in droves, kids darting between rides while their parents queued for overpriced chips and slushies. I'd come with a group of friends, the kind of night where you didn't plan much, just wandered around soaking in the noise and lights. We were near the funhouse when I saw the clown. He was standing off to the side near one of the support beams, watching the crowd. His grin was plastered on, but his eyes darted from face to face, quick and sharp. I hadn't seen him up close in years, and there was something about him that looked off. He seemed thinner, his costume hanging looser than I remembered. His hands were pale, fingers twitching slightly as they clutched a cluster of balloons. A group of teenagers had gathered near him, the kind of lads who thought they were funny but always took things too far. They were jeering at him, making crude jokes and mimicking his laugh. Chester didn't react. Not at first, he just stood there, his balloons swaying slightly as the wind picked up. Then one of them grabbed a balloon and popped it with a sharp snap. The sound cut through the noise of the fair, and I saw Chester flinch. He took a step back, his grin faltering for a split second before snapping back into place. The teenagers laughed, egging each other on, and I felt a pang of pity for him. But there was something else in his expression, something I couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, not exactly, but it was enough to make me uneasy. The group moved on eventually, leaving Chester standing there alone. His balloons were gone, just a few scraps of colored latex littering the ground at his feet. He didn't move for a long time, just stood there staring after them. I thought about going over, saying something, but I didn't. It wasn't my problem, and the night was meant to be fun, not awkward. So I turned back to my friends and we headed towards the dodgems. An hour later, the fairground felt different. The noise seemed duller somehow, the bright lights casting an odd glow over the rides. I noticed people looking around, confused, calling out names. A couple of booths were shut, the attendants gone, and the air felt colder than it had before. I didn't think much of it until we passed the funhouse again. The entrance was roped off, the sign dangling askew, but what caught my eye was the smear of red on the glass. It was bright and wet, streaked as if someone had tried to wipe it away. There was no sign of Chester. The crowd had thinned out by then, people moving towards the exits in clusters. My friends wanted to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I wandered back towards the lot where the workers' trailers were parked. It was darker there, the rides towering over me like skeletons in the dim light. The trailers were silent, their doors shut tight, but as I passed one, I thought I saw movement inside. The window was small, grimy, but the light flickered faintly, and for a moment I thought I saw Chester's face. His makeup was smeared, his eyes wide, staring out at nothing. I didn't stick around to check. As I made my way back towards the main path, I tripped over something lying in the dirt. It was soft and limp, and when I crouched down, I realized it was a balloon. Bright red, perfectly round, its string trailing into the shadows. I looked around, my skin prickling, but the lot was empty. The fairground was quieter now, the rides groaning faintly as the wind picked up. I picked up the balloon and something sticky smeared across my hand. I dropped it immediately, my stomach twisting as I realized it wasn't string attached to the balloon, it was hair. The lights flickered overhead and I felt like I was being pulled in every direction at once. The noise of the fairground was distant now, muffled and strange, like it was coming from another world. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back in the main thoroughfare where the crowds had thinned to almost nothing. I found my friends near the exit and we left without a word. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning the news broke. Several people were missing, teenagers mostly, but a couple of adults too. The fun fair packed up before noon, the trailers rolling out of town like ghosts. Chester was gone, but that wasn't the end of it. The fair turned up in another town a week later. The same rides, the same booths, the same painted sign advertising Chester the Cheerful. The disappearances followed. The fairground was chaos, as always. Lights flashing, music blaring from every direction, rides creaking as they spun and dipped. The air smelled of burnt sugar, hot grease, and something sour underneath it all, maybe the damp wood of the boardwalk. It was the sort of place where you could lose track of time, money, and, as it turned out, people. I'd been working with the traveling fair for about a year, mostly handling the setup and takedown of the rides. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough, and the constant movement suited me. We'd roll into a town, set up in some empty field or car park, and for a few days it was like the world turned inside out. Families came to escape their lives for a night, to laugh, scream, and eat food they'd regret the next morning. Then we packed up and moved on, leaving nothing but tire tracks and litter behind. That night, we were in a smaller town, the kind where everyone seemed to know each other. The fairground was packed with kids running wild, parents trailing after them with tired smiles. I was working near the waltzers, keeping an eye on the queue and making sure the bolts didn't rattle loose. Everything was normal until it wasn't. Someone shouted. It was the kind of sound that cuts through everything, sharp and urgent. A woman was standing near the helter-skelter, her face pale, her hands clutching at empty air. I didn't need to hear her to know what she was saying. Her child was missing. I felt it ripple through the crowd, the way people shifted and glanced around, uneasy. The music kept playing, the rides kept spinning, but something had changed. I stepped down from my post, moving towards the growing knot of people around the woman. She was pointing towards the funhouse, her words tumbling out too fast for anyone to follow. Someone mentioned security cameras, and I saw one of the managers nod, pulling out his radio. The crowd began to spread out, some people searching, others pulling their own children closer. It wasn't the first time a child had wandered off at the fair. It happened more often than you'd think, kids getting distracted by the bright lights and losing track of their parents. Usually they turned up near the food stalls or the toilets, teary-eyed but unharmed. This felt different. They found the security footage quickly enough, a grainy black and white recording from the camera mounted near the funhouse entrance. The child, blonde hair, small backpack, maybe 7 or 8 years old, walking hand in hand with someone in a clown costume. The clown's outfit was standard fare. Bright colors, oversized shoes, a white face with exaggerated features painted on. There wasn't much to go on beyond that, but it was enough to send a shiver through me. None of our clowns wore costumes like that. The fairground crew split up to search, combing through every trailer, tent and ride. I ended up near the back lot where the trailers were parked in a haphazard row. The place was dimly lit, with only a few overhead bulbs casting pools of light on the gravel. The shadows between the trailers seemed deeper than they should have been, and the air felt colder than it had near the rides. I checked the storage units, the ones we used to stash spare parts and tools. They were locked, as always, but I opened them anyway, peering into the cramped, dusty spaces. Nothing. Then I noticed one of the older trailers, the door slightly ajar. It was one of the crew's, though I couldn't remember whose. The trailers all looked the same after a while, their paint faded and chipped from years on the road. The inside was cramped and musty, the air thick with the smell of mildew and something sweeter, like old fruit left to rot. There were boxes piled in one corner, clothes scattered across the small bed, and a table covered in junk, playing cards, coins, a half-empty bottle of something dark. And on the floor, half hidden under a tangle of clothes, was a clown mask. It wasn't the kind you'd buy at a shop. This was hand-painted, the colours smudged but still bright, the mouth twisted into an exaggerated grin. I reached down to pick it up, but before I could touch it, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, my heart hammering in my chest, but the doorway was empty. The gravel outside crunched faintly, as though someone had just moved out of sight. I hesitated, then grabbed the mask and shoved it into my pocket before stepping outside. The search continued late into the night. The fairground closed early, the rides silent and dark as the crew and locals scoured the area, but the child was gone. When the sun came up, the police arrived. They asked questions, took statements, and checked the security footage again and again, but no one recognized the clown. Over the next few days, the fair packed up and left, as it always did. The crew was quieter than usual, their movements stiff and uneasy. I kept the mask, though I didn't know why. It was weeks later in another town when someone found the trailer empty. No sign of its owner, just a few clothes and a scattering of half-eaten food left behind. It wasn't unusual for people to vanish from the fairground life. Some just got tired of it and slipped away. But this was different. No one had seen him leave. No one could recall speaking to him in days, and there was something about the timing that gnawed at me. We moved on again, as we always did, but things were tense. The mask burned a hole in my pocket, though I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. I told myself it was just a piece of painted plastic, nothing more, but every time I looked at it, my skin crawled. The painted grin was wider than I remembered, the eyes somehow sharper. Then the disappearances began again. Another child, this time from the next town. Same story, a child walking hand in hand with someone in a clown costume. The crew whispered about it, their voices low and wary, and I started to notice the way they glanced at one another, suspicion creeping into every look. We all knew the fairground was the perfect place for something like this, the chaos, the crowds, the way people came and went without anyone asking too many questions. It was too easy for someone to slip through the cracks, to use the noise and confusion as a cover. I started keeping an eye on the crew. There was no shortage of suspects. Half of them had records and the other half were odd in ways you couldn't quite put your finger on. But no one fit, not really. They all seemed just as spooked as I was. One night, when the fair was quiet and the trailers were dark, I woke to the sound of gravel crunching outside my window. I lay still, holding my breath as it came closer. The thin curtains didn't hide much, and I could see the faint outline of someone moving past. I crept to the window and peered out, but whoever it was had already vanished into the maze of trailers. My heart was pounding as I stepped outside, the cold air biting against my skin. The lot was empty, silent except for the faint rustle of leaves. I checked the door to my trailer when I got back. It was locked, same as I'd left it. But when I stepped inside, I froze. The mask was on the table. I hadn't taken it out of my pocket, hadn't touched it since the day I found it. But there it was, grinning up at me, the colours bright and garish in the dim light. I stared at it for a long time, my mind racing. Someone had been in my trailer, someone had found the mask and left it there. Or worse, someone wanted me to think they had. The next day I started asking around. Subtle questions, little probes to see if anyone acted strange. No one did. If anything, they seemed more wary of me now, as if they knew I was looking for something. That night, another child disappeared. The fairground crew was searched top to bottom, but nothing turned up. I checked the mask again, half expecting it to have changed somehow, but it was just a mask. Just paint and plastic. I almost threw it away, but something stopped me. I kept it under my bed after that, wrapped in an old shirt. I tried not to think about it, but it was always there in the back of my mind. The disappearances didn't stop. They followed us from town to town, like a shadow we couldn't shake. The clown kept appearing on the security footage, leading children away. Each time, the costume was the same. Bright colors, oversized shoes, and a mask with a grin too wide to be real. One night, near the end of the season, I woke to a sound outside my trailer. It wasn't footsteps this time, more like the faint squeak of a hinge, the creak of metal shifting. I grabbed a torch and stepped outside, my heart in my throat. The fairground was dark and still, the rides hulking shapes against the night sky. I swept the beam of light across the lot, searching for movement. Nothing. Then I heard it, faint, coming from the direction of the funhouse. A laugh, high and thin, cutting through the silence like a knife. I didn't go towards it. I turned and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, the funhouse was closed. One of the mirrors had been shattered, and no one could explain how or why. The crew was jittery, their eyes darting around as if they expected something to leap out at them. We packed up and left that day. I don't know where we were heading, and I didn't care. I just wanted to be away from that place, from the laugh I couldn't get out of my head. The mask is still with me. I don't know why I keep it. Maybe I'm afraid of what will happen if I throw it away. Or maybe I'm afraid that no matter where I leave it, it'll find its way back. The circus was always the highlight of our little town. Every summer the caravans rolled in, their paint peeling but still bright enough to promise something magical. People came from all over, some driving for hours just to get a seat under the big top. It was tradition, I suppose, a way to escape the dull greys of everyday life and step into a world of impossible feats, dazzling colours and roaring laughter. I'd been going since I was a kid, and this year was no different. The night was muggy, the kind that sticks to your skin and makes everything feel closer than it should. The crowd was bigger than I'd ever seen. Families with kids clutching balloons, teenagers sneaking flasks under their jackets, older couples who didn't want to admit they loved the circus as much as anyone. The tent seemed larger this year, though I knew it wasn't. The same red and white stripes stretched high above, held up by ropes and poles that creaked in the breeze. Inside, it was chaos. Vendors shouting about peanuts and popcorn, kids running circles around their parents, and the faint smell of manure drifting from the animal pens just outside. I found my seat near the back, on the wooden bleachers that wobbled when people shifted their weight. The air was warm and stifling, the kind that made you wish for even a hint of wind, but no one seemed to care. The ringmaster stepped into the spotlight, all top hat and tails, and the show began. The first act was the acrobats, soaring through the air with ropes and ribbons that glinted under the dim lights. Then came the clowns, tumbling over each other in their oversized shoes. The crowd loved it, roaring with laughter and clapping until their palms were red. Halfway through, I noticed the smell. It wasn't the usual mix of sawdust and sweat. It was sharper, more bitter, like burnt toast left too long in the toaster. I glanced around, but no one else seemed to notice. The woman next to me was too busy cheering as a juggler balanced a flaming torch on his chin. Then the fire spread. It started with the torches, the ones the juggler had tossed high into the air. One hit the netting above the ring, and the flames caught faster than I'd thought possible. Within seconds, the tent was alive with it. The crowd froze for a moment, a collective intake of breath, and then chaos. People screamed and surged towards the exits, climbing over seats and each other to get out. The lights flickered, casting strange bursts of brightness that made the smoke seem alive. The bleachers groaned under the weight of so many bodies, and I held onto the railing, trying not to be swept away. When I reached the exit, I stopped short. The way out was blocked. Chairs, ropes, and wooden planks had been piled up in front of the flap, forming a barricade that didn't look accidental. People were pushing and clawing at it, but it wouldn't budge. I turned back, looking for another way. The flames were everywhere now, licking up the sides of the tent and dropping embers onto the crowd below. The heat was unbearable, making my skin feel like it was peeling away. I found myself near one of the side entrances, the kind the performers used to slip in and out during their acts. It was locked. The door, a plain wooden thing that looked flimsy enough to break, held firm no matter how hard I shoved. That's when I noticed the bodies. They were pressed against the door, faces turned towards me in twisted grimaces. Their arms were bent at odd angles, and their fingers were bloody, nails ripped away from clawing at the wood. There were 5 of them, maybe 6, packed so tightly together it was hard to tell where one ended and the next began. I stumbled back, my head spinning, and ran towards the center of the tent. The crowd was thinning now, most of them crushed near the barricade or sprawled on the ground where they'd fallen. The performers were nowhere to be seen, and the animals' cages were empty, their doors swinging open. The ringmaster's voice crackled over a loudspeaker, though I couldn't make out the words. He sounded calm, too calm, like he was giving instructions to a crew instead of addressing a panicked crowd. I found another exit near the back of the tent, this one partially open. I crawled through, coughing as the smoke filled my lungs. Outside, the cool air hit me like a slap. I stumbled forward, away from the flames, and collapsed onto the grass. Behind me, the fire raged. The tent, a towering inferno that lit up the night sky. People were still trapped inside, their screams blending with the roar of the flames. The police and fire brigade arrived hours later, though it felt like days. They found dozens of bodies inside, most of them trampled or burned beyond recognition. Others were locked in maintenance areas, the doors barred from the outside. No one could explain it. The barricades, the locked doors, the fire that spread too quickly to be an accident. The ringmaster was gone, along with most of the staff. The circus didn't come back the next year. The field where it had stood was left to grow wild, the grass covering the scars of that night. But sometimes when the wind shifts just right, you can still smell the smoke. It was always damp under the big top, even in summer, and the dim lights flickered just enough to make you squint if you stayed in one place too long. That was the world we lived in, traveling from town to town, unloading the trailers, setting up the tents, performing for a few days before tearing it all down again. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. Samson was the star. That wasn't his real name, of course. I don't think anyone knew his real name. He'd been with the circus longer than anyone except the ringmaster. And even though his act was the same every night, people still gasped and cheered when he stepped into the ring. He was a mountain of a man, with a barrel chest and arms that looked like they'd been carved from stone. His act was simple. He'd lift things, barbells, anvils, even a car once, while the crowd roared. Sometimes, if the audience was especially rowdy, he'd let one of them step forward to challenge him, pinning their arm to the table in a mockery of a fair fight. Samson never lost. But things had changed over the past year. The ringmaster, Daniels, had started pushing him harder, bigger weights, more stunts. The strongest man alive had to keep proving it night after night, and Samson was no spring chicken. You could see it in the way he moved. The stiffness in his shoulders, the slight hitch in his step when he thought no one was looking. I was just a roustabout, one of the ones who set up the props and swept the ring between acts. My job was to stay out of the way and do what I was told, but even I could see the toll it was taking on Samson. He wasn't sleeping, for one thing. His trailer light burned late into the night, and you'd hear him pacing sometimes, the boards creaking under his weight. Then there were the pills, little orange capsules in a plain white bottle tucked into the corner of his kit bag. I didn't mean to see them. I'd been sent to grab a rope from his trailer and found the bag half open, the bottle spilling onto the floor. I didn't ask him about it. You didn't ask Samson questions. The performances started getting more intense. Daniels brought in new props, bigger, flashier, more dangerous. One night, Samson had to hold a platform over his head while two of the acrobats balanced on top, performing flips and twists. The crowd went wild, but Samson's face was bright red, veins bulging in his neck. I thought he was going to drop it, but he held on, his legs trembling until the acrobats climbed down. After that, things spiraled. He started lifting weights that seemed impossible, slabs of iron that took 3 men to haul into the ring. His face was gaunt, his skin slick with sweat even when the night air was cool. He barely spoke to anyone anymore, not that he'd ever been chatty, but now he was silent in a way that made you uneasy just standing near him. Then there was the night with the cannon. Daniels had dreamed up some stunt where Samson would hold a massive cannon on his shoulder while it fired a blank round into the air. The thing weighed nearly as much as a car, and we all knew it wasn't safe, but Daniels insisted. I was standing just outside the ring, holding a fire extinguisher in case the pyrotechnics went wrong. Samson stepped forward, gripping the cannon like it was nothing. The crowd roared as he hoisted it onto his shoulder, the ringmaster spinning some tale about ancient warriors and feats of strength. The cannon fired, a deafening crack that made my ears ring. Samson stumbled just a little, but it was enough. The cannon slipped, crashing to the ground with a sound like a thunderclap. The crowd went silent as Samson stood there, swaying. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. He dropped to his knees, and for a moment I thought he was going to collapse entirely. But then he stood, grabbing the cannon with both hands and lifting it over his head. The crowd erupted, cheering louder than I'd ever heard, but all I could see was the tremor in his arms, the way his chest heaved with each breath. That was the last show he performed. The next morning, his trailer door was padlocked, and Daniels told us all to leave it alone. "He's resting," he said, but no one believed him. Samson didn't show up for breakfast or lunch or dinner. His trailer stayed locked, the light inside flickering faintly at night. A week later, the circus moved on. Samson's trailer was loaded onto the truck with the rest of the equipment, but no one saw him get in. Daniels wouldn't answer any questions, and the others didn't push it. I didn't stay with the circus much longer. A few months later, I got a job at a factory and left that life behind, but sometimes when I think back to those nights under the big top, I wonder what happened to Samson. I think about the pills, the cannon, the way Daniels wouldn't let anyone near his trailer. And I wonder if somewhere out there under the bright lights of another circus, someone else is stepping into the ring, lifting impossible weights while the crowd roars. Or if Samson's still in that trailer, waiting for someone to find him. The circus came alive just before dusk, as it always did. The tents glowed in the fading light, their bright reds and blues a cheerful contrast to the muddy field they had been set up on. Families streamed in, children tugging at their parents' hands, wide-eyed at the sights and sounds. The smell of candy floss hung in the air, mingling with the sharper tang of manure from the animal cages. I'd been working the ticket booth for 3 seasons, ever since I'd lost my job at the garage. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to keep me afloat, and there was something comforting about the routines of it all. The circus was a small world, its rhythms steady and predictable, or so I thought. Everyone loved Marvello the clown. He was the headliner, the one whose picture was plastered on all the posters. Marvello with his wide grin, his red nose, and his ridiculously oversized shoes. Kids adored him. Adults laughed at his antics too, though you could see the unease in their eyes when he got too close. Clowns do that to people. He wasn't much different out of costume, which was odd. Most of the performers seemed like completely different people once the grease paint came off. Not Marvello. He was still loud and boisterous, always cracking jokes, always the center of attention. But there was something else about him, something I couldn't put my finger on. He never talked about his life outside the circus, never mentioned family or friends. He was just there, like he'd always been there. It was Benny who found the newspaper. Benny was one of the roustabouts, a wiry little bloke who could shimmy up a tent pole faster than you'd think possible. He brought the paper to the back lot one evening after the crowds had gone, his face pale and his hands shaking. He didn't show it to me, but I overheard him talking to Maggie, one of the acrobats. Something about a string of unsolved murders, a manhunt, and a face that looked an awful lot like Marvello. The next day, Benny didn't show up for work. People said he'd left in the night, but no one seemed to know why. Maggie didn't say a word about the newspaper, and when I asked her if she'd seen Benny, she just shook her head and walked away. Marvello didn't seem fazed by any of it. He was still there, cracking jokes, making the kids laugh. But I started to notice things, little things. The way he always seemed to know when someone was looking at him. The way his eyes stayed just a fraction too long on people when they weren't looking back. The way he sometimes disappeared for hours, slipping away into the maze of tents and trailers without a word. One night after the last show, I decided to follow him. It wasn't something I'd planned. I just found myself trailing him as he wandered through the lot, staying a few steps behind, careful not to make any noise. He stopped at his trailer, the paint peeling off the sides, and went inside. I waited for what felt like hours, my breath fogging in the cool night air. Then the door creaked open and he stepped out, carrying something in his hands. It looked like a sack, sagging and lumpy, and he moved quickly, heading towards the woods at the edge of the field. I don't know why I followed him. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something darker, a need to confirm what I was already starting to suspect. He slipped between the trees and I crept after him, the sack swaying in his grip. The woods were dark, the faint light from the fun fair fading behind me. The ground was damp and I could hear the squelch of Marvello's shoes as he walked. Then he stopped. I ducked behind a tree, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. He crouched down, setting the sack on the ground. I couldn't see what he was doing, but I heard the sound of something scraping like metal on wood. Then he stood up and stepped back, brushing his hands on his trousers. I waited until he was gone before I moved. My legs felt like jelly and my hands shook as I approached the spot where he'd been. There was a hole in the ground, freshly dug, and the sack was inside it, half covered with dirt. I didn't open it. I couldn't. I just turned and ran, my breath catching in my throat, my feet slipping on the wet leaves. When I reached the edge of the woods, the funfair looked impossibly far away, its lights dim and distant. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't stop thinking about the sack, about what might have been inside it. The next morning, Marvello was there, grinning as always, like nothing had happened. The circus packed up a few days later, the trucks rumbling out of town before dawn. I thought about going to the police, but what could I say? That I'd seen a clown burying a sack in the woods? That I thought he might be the man in the newspaper? The field is empty now, just ruts in the grass and a few scraps of litter left behind. But sometimes when the wind blows just right, I think I can still smell the candy floss. And I wonder where Marvello is now. The fun fair came to town every October, rolling in on rattling trucks that left deep ruts in the damp ground by the park. It was always the same setup, dodgems near the entrance, the Ferris wheel at the far end, and the carousel right in the middle. The carousel was old, older than anything else in the fair. The wood was splintered in places, the paint faded and peeling. The horses were the kind that stared straight ahead with flat, glassy eyes, their manes frozen in wild sweeps. Kids loved it. They'd pile on as soon as the calliope music cranked up, clutching at the brass poles as the ride began to turn. Parents stood around with their phones or chatted by the refreshment stands, the air smelling of fried onions and sugar. No one really noticed the operator. He wasn't one for drawing attention. Thin, pale, with a face like a crumpled newspaper, he moved stiffly, lifting kids onto the horses without a word. He wore the same brown overalls every year, always a size too big, and his cap cast a shadow over his face, leaving just his mouth visible, a thin, pale line. I don't know why I went to the fun fair that year. I didn't have kids, wasn't one for the rides or the crowds. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe I'd heard the rumors. The whispers started not long after the carousel arrived. A child here, another there, just gone. Parents turned away for a moment, thinking their little one had wandered off to another ride. But the kids never turned up again. The police came, of course. They questioned everyone, shut the fair down early one year, but nothing ever came of it. And every October, the trucks rolled in again. It was on the third night of the fair that I decided to take a proper look at the carousel. The air was cool and damp, and the ground squelched underfoot as I wove through the crowds. The lights from the rides reflected on puddles, giving everything a strange, hazy glow. The calliope music drifted towards me, thin and tinny, rising and falling as I approached. The carousel spun lazily, the horses bobbing up and down in time with the music. Kids were clinging to the poles, their faces bright with laughter, while the operator stood at the side, barely moving. I watched him for a while, trying to figure out what it was about him that felt off. He didn't seem to look at the kids as they ran past him to climb aboard. He didn't check the safety straps or smile when the parents waved. He just stood there, his hands clasped loosely in front of him as though he were waiting for something. The carousel slowed to a stop and the kids spilled off, running back to their parents. One small boy hesitated, his fingers still curled around the edge of the horse's saddle. The operator stepped forward, his movements jerky, almost mechanical. He said something, I couldn't hear what, but the boy followed him. They disappeared around the back of the carousel and I felt my stomach twist. I waited, my eyes fixed on the ride. The boy didn't come back. The crowd thinned as the night wore on. Parents herded tired children towards the exits and the rides began to shut down one by one. The carousel was still running though. Its lights flickered and the music seemed quieter somehow. The operator was gone. I circled the ride, stepping carefully over thick electrical cables and puddles of oil, but there was no sign of him. Then I noticed the panel. It was set into the side of the carousel, nearly hidden behind a row of horses. The wood was warped, and the paint had bubbled around the edges. It wasn't locked, just latched with a bit of rusted metal. I pulled it open, and the smell hit me. Damp wood and something else, something sour. Inside was a narrow compartment, just big enough for a child to crawl into. There was a bundle of blankets, a few toys, and something that looked like a tin of biscuits, though it was hard to tell in the dim light. The blankets were stained, and one of the toys, a stuffed rabbit, was missing an ear. I backed away, the bile rising in my throat. I heard footsteps then, soft on the wet ground. Turning, I saw the operator standing just a few feet away. His face was pale, his lips slightly parted as though he'd been caught mid-sentence. His hands hung loosely by his sides, and for a moment neither of us moved. Then he stepped forward and I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my flat, the door locked and bolted behind me. I didn't sleep that night or the next. By the time I worked up the nerve to go back to the park, the fair was gone. All that remained were deep ruts in the grass and a scattering of rubbish. The police didn't believe me. They said the carousel had been inspected years ago, that there was no evidence of anything suspicious. I couldn't prove otherwise. But every October, when the fun fair rolls into another town, I see the posters. Bright colors, smiling faces, promises of excitement. And in the middle of it all, the carousel. I didn't expect it to be like this. Not at all. I joined the circus as an apprentice because, well, I didn't have much else going for me. My mum had always dreamed of me becoming a performer, and maybe I was hoping it would be my way out of a dead-end life. It wasn't glamorous, but there was something about the circus that had always drawn me in. The noise, the excitement, the color. Even now, after all these months, I couldn't quite shake the feeling of being part of something bigger than myself. It was just another long, hot day on the circus grounds. The summer was reaching its peak, and the place was bustling with activity. The smell of stale popcorn mixed with sawdust, the sound of distant laughter, the screams of children from the Ferris wheel. It was familiar, comforting, even if the heat made everything feel a bit too close. I was working on the grounds running errands for the older performers when I came across something strange. I was in one of the old trailers, the ones used for storage, when I noticed a small, dusty book tucked behind a stack of old costumes. It was an old leather-bound diary, its edges frayed, the cover worn and cracked. There was no name on it, but the strange thing was that it looked as if it had been there for decades. The others wouldn't have noticed it, or if they had, they wouldn't have cared. To them, it was just more junk. But there was something about it that made me pick it up, curiosity gnawing at me. I dusted it off and opened it. The handwriting was messy, erratic. It took me a while to make out the words, but eventually they came into focus. The entries were dated, stretching back almost 30 years, all written by someone named Lionel. I'd never heard of a Lionel in the circus, but that didn't seem unusual. After all, a lot of performers came and went over the years. The diaries seemed innocuous, full of mundane details about life on the circus, the heat, the exhaustion, the long hours. But as I read on, the tone shifted. Lionel wrote about his struggles as a clown, how the audiences had begun to lose interest in him, how he'd grown tired of the same old routines. The more I read, the more it felt as if something was slipping beneath the surface of his words. There was an underlying bitterness, a sense of growing desperation. Then towards the end of the diary, things took a darker turn. Lionel wrote about a performance, one that he described as the pinnacle of his career. He was performing a new act, something dangerous, too dangerous in hindsight. He wrote about how everything had gone perfectly, how the audience had laughed and cheered, but then something had gone wrong. And that's where the entries stopped making sense. The final entry was brief, almost cryptic. It described an accident, an act gone horribly wrong. Lionel spoke about the audience's panic, their screams. He described how the trapdoor had malfunctioned, how the rope snapped, how people had been crushed. The last line was chilling. "We all died, I will make them remember me." That was it, the diary ended there, and I sat in the dim light of the trailer, staring at the last words. There was something so unsettling about it, as though the ink had been stained with something darker than just words. I couldn't shake the image of the dying clown or the horror he had witnessed. Something about it lingered in my mind. I didn't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to put the diary down. The more I thought about it, the more it haunted me. I kept replaying the words in my head, especially the part where Lionel wrote about wanting to be remembered. He hadn't just wanted to entertain, he had wanted something more, something that went beyond just applause. Over the next few days, I began to feel strange. At night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was filled with vivid, unsettling dreams. I would see flashes of past performances, of Lionel in his clown makeup, performing in front of a packed crowd. But there was something wrong about it. His movements were stiff, almost mechanical, and the audience's laughter felt hollow. And then the crash. The sound of bodies falling, screams rising above the chaos. Each dream felt so real, like I was right there watching as it all unfolded. I thought it was just stress, or maybe the heat. After all, I'd been working long hours, and the fairground was always buzzing with noise and activity. But then the visions began when I was awake. I'd be walking through the circus grounds, and for a split second I'd catch a glimpse of something. Someone in the corner of my eye, a clown, standing in the shadows, his painted face twisted in a grotesque grin. The first time it happened, I thought it was just a trick of the light. But then it happened again and again. It was always the same clown, Lionel. I didn't know how, but I began to feel as though he was watching me, as if he was waiting for something, for me to do something. The oddest part was that I couldn't stop thinking about the final entry in his diary. "We all died. I will make them remember me." It kept echoing in my mind like a song stuck on repeat. I found myself drawn to the circus tent even when there was nothing going on. The quiet emptiness of it felt like a void that I couldn't resist. I'd sit in the stands staring at the empty ring, and I'd start to imagine what the final performance must have been like. The trapdoor, the ropes, the crash, the smell of burnt popcorn, the panic, and then in the distance I'd hear it, a laugh, a muffled, echoing laugh that didn't belong to anyone. One night I couldn't take it any longer. I snuck into the ring, the lights were off, but I could still make out the outline of the trapdoor in the center of the ring. The ropes that hung down looked like they'd been used recently. I felt my heartbeat quicken, my breath shallow. I don't know why I did it, but I opened the trapdoor. I could feel something pulling at me, a compulsion, like I had no choice. The smell of sawdust, the faint hint of burnt wood, and then, in the darkness below, I saw it, a clown's shoes, large, too large for anyone to wear. I stepped back, but I couldn't move fast enough. My heart raced as someone grabbed my wrist. I couldn't pull away. I tried, but it was like my body wasn't listening to me. Then I heard it, faint, but growing louder, a laugh. It wasn't mine, it wasn't anyone's, and I knew deep down that I wasn't going to be able to leave until I did exactly what Lionel had done. The last entry was still in my head, the final act, the crash, the death, the remembered screams. I was starting to understand. The tent loomed in the distance, its crimson stripes stark against the grey skies. I'd never been one for the circus, but today was different. Curiosity had drawn me here. It wasn't the clowns or the animals, but the tightrope walker. Lydia Rose. Her name was whispered through the town like a secret, a performer who danced above death without a care. I found a spot in the crowded stands, the faint smell of popcorn mingling with damp earth. Lydia emerged from the shadows, dressed in sequins that sparkled even under the dim lights. She bowed once, briefly, before stepping onto the rope. Her arms stretched out as though she carried the weight of the world in her hands. The audience fell silent as she walked. Her movements were elegant, almost inhumanly so, as though gravity were a suggestion, not a rule. She reached the middle of the rope, and for a moment time seemed to stop. The air felt different. Then she fell. There was no sound except for the dull, sickening thud of her body hitting the net below. It wasn't supposed to happen, I knew that much. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but no screams came. Lydia lay there, motionless, and then the net sagged and gave way, dumping her onto the dirt floor. The crowd surged to their feet as figures in dark clothing rushed to her. They tried to shield her from view, but it was too late. Blood pooled beneath her, dark and shimmering under the lights. It wasn't until the crowd was ushered out and I found myself wandering the grounds that the unease began to creep in. There was something odd about the way the performers moved backstage, their whispers sharp and urgent. Lydia's death wasn't an accident, someone murmured. Someone else hissed back that they didn't know anything for sure. The police came the next morning, but the circus was already packing up. They didn't seem surprised. Performers were transient people, and Lydia Rose's death was a tragedy, not a mystery, at least that's what they said. But I stayed. Something didn't sit right with me. Maybe it was the way the tightrope itself had swayed, just a fraction too much, or the expression on Lydia's face before she fell. Fear. Not surprise, not focus, fear. The circus troupe avoided me as the days went on, their usual charm replaced by sidelong glances and hushed tones. I didn't belong here, and they made no effort to hide their resentment, but I watched. I watched the way the strongman snapped at the juggler, the way the ringmaster's face tightened when anyone mentioned Lydia's name, the way her trailer sat untouched, her belongings still inside as though she might come back at any moment. When the second accident happened, I was nearby. One of the clowns, Tommy I think his name was, slipped while practicing his act. His fall wasn't as far as Lydia's, but it was enough. The crack of bone echoed through the empty tent. His colleagues rushed to him, shouting, but there was something in their eyes, something colder than grief. It didn't take long for the rumors to spread. Lydia had been the star, and some of the others resented her. She drew the biggest crowds, took the highest pay. There were arguments, heated ones, about who would inherit her position. The strongman claimed it should be him. He was the longest-serving member, after all. The acrobat insisted she deserved it. She had trained alongside Lydia for years. The ringmaster said nothing, but his gaze lingered too long on the empty tightrope, as though he saw something no one else did. I didn't see who found the note, but I heard about it later. Scribbled on a scrap of paper tucked into Lydia's costume trunk were the words, "They'll never forgive me." The police dismissed it as guilt, an accident Lydia had foreseen but couldn't prevent. I wasn't so sure. The handwriting was shaky, hesitant, but the words felt wrong, forced. Then the fire happened. It started in one of the animal cages, spreading fast through the tents. By the time it was under control, the strong man was dead. He'd been trapped inside his trailer, or so they said, but I had seen him earlier near Lydia's trailer arguing with someone I couldn't quite make out. The circus folded not long after that. People were too scared to come, and the performers were too scared to stay. The police called it a series of unfortunate accidents. I tried to forget, to move on, but some nights I still see Lydia's face in my mind, that flash of fear. I sometimes wonder if I should have left it alone, if I should have stopped asking questions, stopped piecing together fragments of conversations, glances and movements. But I can't, because when I walked past Lydia's trailer the night before the fire, I saw something strange. Her trunk was open, the costumes untouched. And in the dust beneath the tightrope, someone had written a single word, faint but unmistakable: murder.